Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Windows Baselining and Remote System Assessment for the low, low price of free 90 free. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I'll be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Chris Pizor and John Strand, both are SANS instructors. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Chris.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, John, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for all the attendees for joining. I know all of your time is valuable, so hopefully you leave this feeling that your time was well spent as we talk about Windows baselining and how we can assess remote systems. Now, the kind of bottom tagline with this is just because I've been at the receiving end of multiple sales pitches over the years where product X is supposed to save the day, and it's going to just cost my organization couple $100,000, possibly even up into the millions of dollars, depending on the security product that we're talking about. And many of them today, they're simply doing a lot of scripts running in the background. There's some, of course, that are more involved, but it doesn't have to cost a ton of money to know what is normal in your environment or to assess the systems that are in your environments. Because of the fact that Windows has such a large market share around the globe today, especially in corporate environments, that's why for this webcast we're really focusing on Windows because of that large market share that it does have. So as we go through today, we're going to talk about a number of different topics with this. Ranging from how we can gather system details from command line, how we can touch on this from WMIC, PowerShell, and really why you need to understand how to do this in multiple different ways. Understanding what is normal is one of those things that is preached in most forensic analysis classes and most incident response classes, simply because it does make finding evil things in the network a whole lot easier. Our endpoints today are under attack more than they ever have been. Social engineering and client-side attacks are really what dominates today because it's the easiest way in. I know many of the social engineering attacks that I've received personally via email at work as well as at my home email address, they are getting harder and harder to pick apart the fact that it is actually a social engineering attack and not something that's legitimate. So that's why this becomes so important. We have to know what is normal. Now, system baselines are essentially just a snapshot of what is a known good state. And this is something that honestly is going to change over time. Now we have to start from an initial clean snapshot, and then as patches are applied to the system, we need to kind of refresh that baseline snapshot to understand what is normal. Now, depending on how we do this, this can be doing holistic backups where we have a full snapshot of the system that can be deployed in case the system gets compromised to make things easier. That way you don't have 50 patches to apply to a system to bring it back online. But more so, this is really focusing on understanding what the normal processes that are running, understanding the normal network activity and things of that nature, things that apply or consolidate everything that you've applied as part of a hardening template on any group policies that have been applied to the system. And then that gives you a good, clean snapshot to be able to assess other systems against. So anytime you have a user complaining that something is acting slow, this is one of those things that you need to check. One of the very first incident response cases I worked on back in, the early 2000s involved a user complaint where the user was just simply complaining that their system was acting slow. Now, this is one of those situations where most help desks are often going to blow it off as Bob is just complaining again, or there goes Susie again, complaining that her system's not working right. But in this case, we actually had a help desk technician that was pretty proactive, and he jumped on it and started looking at it. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Are you running
You're
slides?
still on the automotive summit. Could you bring up the slides?
Sorry. Okay. I thought I had hit play on that, so it would have changed.
There we go.
Thank you for calling that out. So,
thanks.
Yep. So back to that. This help desk guy, he went through and was looking at the system, looking at what was running on it, wasn't seeing anything abnormal as far as running processes on the surface of things. But once he started looking at network traffic, it was after hours, and identified some anomalies in network traffic. Now this was late at night, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. The system is just running. There are no extra processes running. The web browser is closed, and he sees a steady stream of DNS traffic coming off of this system. So this was one of those first incidents of DNS tunneling that I had ever observed. And the attackers were doing this via command and or they were doing this for their command and control, any data infill and exfil, and essentially they had Trojanized the system. The malware itself was actually sitting in an alternate data stream, and the system was a Windows 2000 box. So there was no built-in capability to identify that the ADS was there back at that point in time. Antivirus did not capture anything regarding or was not able to scan alternate data streams looking for malware as well. So it was kind of a perfect storm of things, but it went back to that user complaint. And that's where anytime that we get an odd user complaint where it's just simply the system is acting slow, it's taking 5 minutes to boot up, we can look at what's running on the system, compare that to a system baseline that we have, and that's going to help us quickly understand what new is going on in that compared to our baseline from the beginning of the week. So that's what the whole goal of this is really being able to quickly identify deviations from the normal state of that system. Now, if you have a rootkit in place, basic system assessment like this likely is not going to pick it up. That's where your network traffic comes in.
And I agree that, hi everybody, this is John, I'm hanging out here too. So I agree that, a lot of these tools won't work, but this is kind of one of those things that we talk about quite a bit in class about how you've got to learn how to ask a question in multiple different ways. And I think a little bit later, Chris talks about multiple different ways that you can use baselining, all the way from command line, WMIC to PowerShell. And the reason why we do that is because if an attacker is hooked into one of those ways, they may not have hooked into all of those ways. And that just kind of builds up our skill set as defenders, and it makes it a lot more difficult for the attacker to hide.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. One of the other tools that I use, or tool suites that I use quite a bit, is the sysinternal suite from Microsoft and Mark Rusinovich. There are some fantastic capabilities in there that can help you identify rootkit behavior without having to go to network traffic or a memory image to do so. So, as John said, expand your repertoire, play with other tools, look for other ways to ask those same questions. So thanks again for chiming in, John. I appreciate that.
You bet.
So it's absolutely about finding that wolf in sheep's clothing in this case. When we start talking advanced attackers, APT groups, my experience with them has been that they're going to get on the system and they're going to remain quiet at first. Now they're going to typically try to maintain or gain some type of persistence on the system, but some of the observed behavior I've seen has been them just sit there, ask questions of the system to identify who are the local users, who are the admins on the system, throw the network card into promiscuous mode if they've gotten admin or root to sniff traffic to see what other systems are there, what protocols do you allow in the environment. And from there, once they've identified things at the system level as well as network traffic level, that's when you start seeing them utilize those protocols that are allowed and any credentials that they've been able to gather to start moving laterally within the environment. Your more sloppy attackers, they're the ones that are going to get in and start throwing exploits. Much harder, or that's much easier to detect. So your APT groups want to remain stealthy, and they're going to utilize what's already there if at all possible. So we're not always going to see actual executable malware dropped on the system. This is where we see the fileless type malware for kind of the broad category, where attackers have dropped a series of different PowerShell scripts that are going to start up into the registry to maintain their persistence and beacon out to them at some sort of specified period. So your system baseline as a whole should focus on a number of different data points. These are the primary ones that I typically look to as a minimum standard baseline. Now you could go well beyond this, or you could focus on just a couple main data points being running processes, services, and network activity. The problem with just focusing on those is attackers, as I've mentioned, don't always introduce new processes. If they're able to quickly gather user account credits, maybe they just use that to authenticate remotely back into the system. Additionally, when we start talking device drivers and rootkits that disguise themselves as device drivers, we need to know what normal is there. That's what our file integrity monitoring solutions will do, but those can be expensive. We can accomplish the same thing by simply hashing drivers, hashing all the critical system files, and then checking those things periodically. So understanding the processes, services and their states, if any new services do show up, that should be a key sign that we need to look into. Now, a lot of folks will often bring up that they don't have standard baselines. Some of the client sites that I've been in at different points, when I bring up the idea of a system baseline to them, I often get laughs because they've got some systems running Windows 10, some running Windows 7, some Windows 7 Service Pack 1, and then the third-party software on those systems varies widely between the different ones. At that point, system baselining definitely becomes a whole lot harder, and we'll talk a little bit later on how we can handle that. But then again, if you understand what would normally be running on a Windows 7 box, that helps you identify those anomalies. Now, from this, understanding auditing settings, this is kind of going back to even group policy in the network. You should understand what group policy is being pushed out to your systems, because that's going to impact the firewall settings. It's going to impact auditing as a whole. These two things, I've seen a number of attackers get in, and if they can modify the auditing settings so that they're not leaving detailed trails through the audit logs on the Windows system, it's going to that should be a red flag for us. It helps them cover their tracks, but it should be a red flag for us if any of those auditing settings are changed. Same thing with firewall settings, but because most attackers today are trying to just get their stuff to call out, unless you're doing outbound filtering, you're going to completely miss that. Patches, same thing. I've seen in some cases where an attacker has actually rolled back a patch. So we had patched against a vulnerability, the attacker actually removes the patch to be able to open up a possible way for them to privilege escalate or whatever the purpose was behind that patch. User accounts, in overall admin group folks for local admin. This is another way that attackers will often try to, maintain persistence on the system, but also to move laterally. If we have the same local user accounts across multiple systems, they will use those instead of domain-based accounts, often to avoid detection. So how do we do this? In the Windows command line has a number of different functions that are available to us. Some that support remoting by themselves, and this is just a few of the ones that kind of play into our baselining concepts here. So task list is great. We can leverage it to reach across the network, query a couple different systems, and pull back that task list and look at it compared to what our baseline is. And same thing with these others. Scheduled tasks becomes important just because of the fact that a lot of attackers will use that as a persistence mechanism to kick off malware, kick off a script to send them back a command shell or PowerShell. So we need to understand those. Now, there's a lot of other commands that play into baseline and that do not support remoting by themselves. So we have to leverage other capabilities to get that remote execution to pull the data back from systems. And that's that being one of the primary ones. We want to know what our network-based activity is. What are the local listening ports that are being set up on the system? And then even active network connections. This can help identify anything that's anomalous, but we just have to know what would normally be running, what normal callouts are going to be occurring from our system hopefully not directed to third-party vendors, but depending on how you've configured your environment, you could still see that. But when we cannot execute commands, or for our commands that don't support remoting natively, this is where tools like psexec from the sysinternal suite is fantastic. WinRM has a command line command called WinRS that will allow you to actually leverage the WinRM protocol across the network to reach in with that. Now, of course, that becomes kind of a risk management decision for the organization. There's some organizations that, go ahead, John.
I was going to talk Windows WinRM is one of those interesting commands that it can send it over HTTPS or over HTTP. And people get freaked out over switching it over to HTTPS. But if you actually look at the HTTP, it's being sent HTTP, but the actual data itself is still encrypted within that HTTP stream. So the overall risk is not that great. If you go HTTP or HTTPS, it's still going to be encrypted either way.
Yeah, excellent. My focus on that, or what I've encountered from some folks, has been just they're saying that an attacker will use it to move laterally, which my response commonly is just simply, if that's not enabled for them to move laterally, they're going to move via SMB typically, or RDP.
Exactly, even WMI. I mean, there's so many different ways that they can move laterally. Just basically Active Directory, once you're logged in, if you don't have your firewalls enabled on your workstations, it doesn't really matter. They're going to be able to move laterally. And adding WinRM is not going to all of a sudden make it so that they can take over your organization in ways that were previously unknown or unavailable to them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've tried convincing them of that, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. So that's when usually we try to demo the capabilities of lateral movement without WinRM being enabled, just to show that it really doesn't matter. In fact, actually disabling WinRM, you're now hamstringing the incident response team to a point, because PowerShell gives you some interesting capabilities that don't exist otherwise, just with the scripting capabilities there and some of the tool sets that already exist that can help us with this. So, yeah, great. So here I've just got a couple screenshots, and I'm going to flip over to some VMs to show some other options with this, but hopefully it's not too small with this on your screens back at home or in the office. But with task list, we just give it a switch of /s and the machine name or IP address, and then we pass it the username, password, and it'll execute that command on the remote system for us. Same thing when we do WinRS and even psexec, we're going to have to give it those same data points. What machine, username, password. Now, if you're in a domain environment, many of these tools, especially built-in Windows tools, they will pass your Kerberos ticket for you, so you don't have to provide the command line credentials. All of that is encrypted, so it's not in the clear. So we have some security built in as we go across the network. Now, this is showing some of those key data points we want. What are the running processes on the system? What are the active network connections that are there, active and listening connections that we have? Understanding what that baseline is can help identify anomalies that are introduced. Now, we have to rule out the possibilities of it being some third-party application that has been added, but ultimately that's something that we're going to have to comb through and look at that data and assess the system a little further once we've identified an anomaly. So we've got a brief anomaly here in the network connection, and I'll go ahead and highlight that for you here. So we've got a listener on port quad 4. That's definitely not normal. And then I'm sure a number of you've kind of picked out are not a hacker, and I can draw really straight with this thing. So I apologize for the squiggly line that's there.
It's a skill that I never really mastered at all.
Yeah, every time I try it, I embarrass myself by how unstraight the line is. I didn't pass an art class in elementary school, so I guess that's why. So let me switch over to, actually, no, I'm going to jump into WMIC, and then I'll circle back to kind of do a demo showing a couple of these things. But WMIC, as John mentioned, yet another fantastic tool, communicates across the network via DCOM typically. So with this, it's going to be on every system from Windows XP Service Pack 3 and later. You can install it on Service Pack 2. And why do I say this? And I say it's simply because, well, there's still about 20% market share out there that's still using XP. And I know from kind of asking different students over the years and other clients that I run into, what's the oldest operating system you have in your inventory? And don't be embarrassed by it. And there's still some, Windows 98, 95, 3.1 for work groups, you name it. There's still some of those systems out there. Ideally, you don't have those on your domain, but those types of systems you may need to assess, and there the command structure is going to differ even more than what we're currently talking about, just since WMIC did not exist there. But WMIC is fantastic for grabbing the process list, and with it we've got some options where we can do a process list brief, we can do a process list full, and it's going to give a variety of data points. The brief version shows us some basic details, and I'm going to switch over because it's going to illustrate this just a little bit better. So if we do a WMIC process process list brief, you can see it shows me an output very much like I would get with task list. But if I do a full, so I'll just up arrow, change brief to full, I'm going to get more data points. And as soon as this is done scrolling, I'll highlight a couple of the important ones. Actually, one of the most important here is going to be the parent process ID. So that relationship between the child and parent process is one of those things that is pretty important. We can look at working set size for an identifier if something's using unusually a large amount of memory. That could potentially indicate a piece of malware, and especially today, since you're seeing a lot more malware that's just doing Bitcoin mining that's getting dropped on systems, that could be an immediate indicator that you may have something like that on your system. So here we got process ID. Should have the parent process ID showing up just above that. These are some indicators that are important, and we can do filtering on this as well with WMIC, where we could do WMIC process, where, let's see, process ID. Excuse my typing in public. This is one of those things that I should have just already had typed out instead of going free flow. And with this, there's a number of different details we can get that would be of interest to us. The command line invocation can be nice. It does show us the path that the process is running from. Parent process ID, once again, for tracing that relationship back and forth. And we can do this remotely by adding the /node modifier in here. And ultimately, it gives us a great amount of data to go off of for that baseline. Now, QFE list. So what are our quick fixes that have been identified is another one of those data points. So as we're applying patches to the system, you always want to, as part of your patch management process, do a validation that the patches have actually been applied. So you've got to circle back around and not just blindly trust that they have been applied. So this is something you should be assessing each system within a day or 2 days of pushing patches out. If not even sooner. So this is one of those repetitive tasks that scheduled tasks can be great for identifying, is it there, is it not? Now, WMIC has so many different possible capabilities of what we can gather. So these are just a few of them. And with the /node modifier that we have here, command line option that we have, that helps us query a big variety of systems. We can feed it a text document that has each system listed on its own line by system name or by IP address, and it'll grab your credentials and it'll log into those remote systems and pull back whatever data you want. You could then script it out so that that is then compared against the known good baseline so that you have a good listing of what is there. Now, PowerShell, kind of same thing, yet another way to grab the same types of information. It's going to query it slightly different, but we've got all those same options we've talked about for the most part. So with this, we can get the hot fixes. We can get the running process with get process, get service to get services. Now, the one difference here is on the Windows side or regular Windows command line, we can use the netstat command to identify what are those listening ports, what are our active network connections. We don't exactly have a netstat equivalent per se on the PowerShell side. What we have is get net TCP connection and get net UDP connection. So we'd have to run 2 commandlets to get the same type of data. Now, it gives you some great details about this, but the output's really not quite as clean. Nice thing with PowerShell is it can often pass a lot of regular Windows command line commands down to it has aliases built so that it is able to still execute them. Netstat's one that it doesn't always work right with, especially if you start adding command line switches to it. The other option that we have with that we have with PowerShell, and I wanted to call so much attention to it, I'm just noticing that I wrote it down twice here, is get file hash. So with get file hash, it gives us a built-in capability to pull hashes of any file that we want, built into PowerShell version 3 and later. We do have an option for doing that at the Windows command line through the certutil tool. It's not quite as clean as what get file hash is, but it'll work just as well. The one thing you have to be cautious with using these built-in tools, though, is once again, like John said, if we've got a rootkit present, depending on what the attacker has done, and if we're talking user mode rootkit versus kernel mode rootkit, we may get results that have been modified, we'll say. So if they actually modify the get file hash commandlet, we could end up having trouble getting accurate hashes. So that's where you ask for a second opinion using something like certutil or MD5 sum or SHA-1 sum or some other external third-party tool to get this. So we want to gather details on, once again, all of these different data points that I've mentioned so far, the processes, services, scheduled tasks I've hit for persistence, your startup items, once again, for persistence, simply because attackers are going to want to maintain persistence once they get on. The auto runs tool is fantastic for this as well. It has a command line variant called auto run C. And then with tools like PSExec, as I had shown earlier, we can actually have it push that tool across the network for us. So the reason why we need these 3 options. So this is, these are 3 of the possible answers. And there are many other reasons. John mentioned the other one, and that is for querying the same question multiple ways to the system to assess, is it clean? Is it not? But it provides you a lot of additional flexibility. Some of these commands are going to be easier than others to use. And part of this is going to go back even to your familiarity with each of them. I know personally, I'm much more well-versed currently at Windows command line and WMIC. PowerShell I'm decent with, but I'm not to an advanced level on it yet. So that's one of those personal areas I'm working on. But that service availability piece is the other thing. So some of a lot of your Windows command line options that we talked about earlier are being sent across the network just using the server message block protocol. WMIC is typically via DCOM. And then as John said, with PowerShell, we've got HTTP and HTTPS capabilities, but also we need that WinRM service enabled. So depending on the environment you're in, you may have access to one, but not the other. So understanding how to query multiple ways and not letting that be a stopping point for you is one of those critical things. The other piece is standardization of the data that you're pulling back. Depending on how you pull the data back, filtering through it and trying to identify the anomalies, if you're using 2 different methods to pull the data back, it's going to make correlation a little bit more difficult. So I talked just a little bit about comparing results here using a few different built-in tools or a few different methods that we can. So we have the file compare command at the Windows command line that it can help you get to an answer when you're dealing with a small data set. So here I just kind of show an example of, I've got some netstat output, and this shows how file compare is going to go about kind of splitting things up to show us from one machine to the other, what are some of the things that stand out. When we look at this screenshot, we see we've got port 4444 open up on the student2.net or from the student2 machine. Down below that, we see our baseline that does not include port 444. And then, but our baseline also has port 3333 open, but not 444, but the second machine does not. So we have some differences there even between what our baseline has and the other system. So this would be indicative of the possibility that an attacker has shut off a service, but also stood up some sort of backdoor capability on the system. So this overall, not great for very large data sets, but it is something that you could use, and you could drop it into a for loop. This is something I was playing with a little bit the other day. Drop it into a for loop using the delims command or delims modifier or command line switch for f loop, and you can focus in just on local addresses or just on foreign addresses to kind of clear out some of the other chatter, just because the differences will include the process ID being different between the systems. So that's one of the lim facts of using file compare, the FC command, for doing this type of task. The other option, and where I've ended up spending a lot of my time comparing larger data sets when we're talking 500, 1,000 machines or more, is actually outputting it into a spreadsheet, whether it be through an H table, which is an option we can use in WMIC, or to a CSV file, which we can output to in WMIC or PowerShell. Importing this into Excel and using some basic filtering, or if you want to get really fancy, drop it in, create some pivot tables to help you hone in on the anomalies that do occur in the system. With this, we're really looking for one-off type things, at least initially. So that's where the filtering capabilities come into play, and overall the pivot tables can help you pretty quickly get to the anomalous activity. Definitely a lot quicker than file compare, but no matter what, when we start comparing multiple systems to a baseline, it's going to be fairly labor intensive. There are some scripting capabilities you could get into that will help narrow the focus a little bit quicker, but there's still going to be a manual analysis component to it almost no matter what, unless it's something that's just very, very blatant in how it stands out. Now, there's a number of other PowerShell projects that are out there, and Consa is fantastic. If you have not used it before, I definitely recommend you kind of pull it in, look at it. It's written by Dave Hull a couple of years back. And it's just a series of different PowerShell scripts that can help you for doing baselining, but also they help you do long tail analysis, which is great for situations where you don't have a baseline. If you don't know what normal is, this can help you establish what normal is, but additionally, it can help you narrow down, once again, what are those unique attributes on different systems that you're querying, so it can help you get to that point pretty quickly. PS Recon is kind of a similar framework that's really designed for incident response. Personally, I like Consa better, but PS Recon is kind of a close second. And then if you're getting into doing hard disk forensics, that's where Power Forensics by Jared Atkinson comes into play. All of these are PowerShell based tools. One of the things that I've started doing more and more is I'll look at tools like these and even take some of the individual scripts that they have created in it if I don't need the full capability provided by it, and I'll repurpose those pieces to do what I need to for smaller projects. Now, as you go through and you're doing data filtering, there are a number of things that we can do to try to help highlight the results, and that's where kind of command line wise, I've ginned up a couple different commands that, wow, don't want to show up here. Let me escape my history, or not. Okay, that command line is dead.
System pros.
Yeah, let's see what we've got here on the PowerShell side, because I did kind of set this up a little bit. So here I've got a little PowerShell where I'm running the invoke command to just get processes off of two systems that I've got running in the background here, where I'm doing a little basic sorting just based on name, and then having it pare the data set down by only showing me the unique values that are in there. And with that, it should reach out, query my systems, and then the only things it's going to return, as I mentioned, are unique values. So yes, every system is going to have multiple SVC hosts running because they're Windows 10 systems that I'm reaching out to. You're looking at there's probably 10 SVC hosts on each system, but in this case, it only chose to return one of them for me from student 2. Now it is running on all the other systems, but when I look through at other unique values that are running, I can see I've got a command prompt running on student 3. Is that a valid process that should be running? Most cases, unless you've got an admin on the system, your typical users are not going to be doing anything from a command prompt. So that would be an investigation point. Here I've got this other executable, just NC, which should stand out to anyone that has taken 504 or 401, as most SANS classes highlight the basic capabilities within Netcat. Kind of an old tool, but still an effective tool. You're probably not going to see it at the center of many compromises today, but still something interesting. Another one that's kind of meant to stand out is Google update process. So I would have a couple data points just from this output. Looking at the two machines, I could compare this to what I would get with get process on my baseline system and have a couple points that I need to jump out to. John, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is so key. The ability to identify the discrepancies between multiple systems, because we spend a lot of time talking about baselining what is normal. And you can do that. Like you mentioned, Kansa from Dave Hull is a fantastic tool for this. But the problem that many people have is they just don't have time to sit and go and learn every single process and what these processes are doing and what these processes don't do. So the ability to stack and compare and just pull up things that are unique makes it much easier for the incident responder to focus on just those specific areas that might be malware within that environment. So this is an awesome command.
Yeah. Yeah, overall, this is kind of a simple illustration of what you can get from a single one-liner in PowerShell, just building on those capabilities, piping output into some other commandlets to help make the data more usable. And you could do this across 100 machines. Your output, of course, is probably going to be a little bit bigger, but because I'm focusing just on what are the unique strings that are showing up, it will pretty quickly help me identify anything that is standing out. And then what I love about PowerShell using it this way is the fact that it shows me the computer name that it pulled it from. So definitely, if you're not using PowerShell today, this is one of those areas that for professional growth and improvement, definitely an area that you really need to start looking into, because if you have a Windows environment, it's what's there, especially when you start looking at the capabilities in PowerShell version 5. It is just awesome compared to what we had with some of the older versions that are out there. Okay, so for the baselining portion, overall, and I said this up front, you've got to know what normal is. The big thing that I often see when I'm talking to different students or other clients is cost of different products. And when you talk to C-level executives, they're all under the mindset that you've got to spend a fortune on security to become secure. So they often are paralyzed and don't want to do anything. But it really doesn't have to cost a lot of money. This is something, equip your incident responders or your security team with the appropriate resources and give them training where necessary, and they can accomplish a lot. It's not to say you don't need security products throughout the environment, because you absolutely do for catching the low-hanging fruit, but a lot of your advanced attackers are caught more through diligent security professionals that are essentially jumping in and questioning systems. Am I really seeing, is this system really clean? And that's where the threat hunting aspects come into play. the more you get used to doing it, the easier it becomes to identify those anomalies. So practice, and you will get better and better at this stuff as you go on. Now, John, I know you wanted to talk about Caldera, which is automated adversary
Emulation.
Emulation system. That was the word I was looking for. Sorry. Yep. Thank you. So I will pass this over to you so you can bring things up and talk to it.
Very cool. So you got to right click, make presenter, and then it's going to give me the option to do so.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
Show my screen, and there is my screen. All right, so there's a couple of different things. It's not just Caldera. I'm also going to talk about Unfetter and also Common. It's an uber common tool called Meta. So we're going to go through each of them because they do a lot of the exact same thing. So let me start out by talking about Caldera. And yes, my slides are incredibly basic because Joff got on an airplane, and before he got on the airplane, he enabled the IP tables rules on our Caldera server. All right, so Caldera was created by MITRE to basically track all of the different things that you can look into with the MITRE attack framework and the techniques matrix of the different types of tactics and techniques that a bad guy can use. This is critical because there's a lot of them. Let me actually just open up that website right now. We go MITRE technique matrix. Here we go, and bam. All right, so these are all the different techniques that are currently in the technique matrix. Now, the reason why this is key is if you're trying to identify every single adversary and all the different groups that exist, it can become almost impossible, especially whenever a lot of the adversarial groups that are out there, the different APTs, the different panda groups that exist, are actually going through the process now of making their attacks look like another group's attacks. We saw this with the CIA breach last year. They actually had documentation basically teaching people how to make their attacks look like another threat actor. So it becomes very hard to try to detect a specific threat actor. However, the matrix of the different techniques that they use is pretty static. I mean, there's things being added to it, but nowhere near as fast as the number of different threat actors that are out there. So if we have a quantifiable universe of different types of techniques and tactics that bad guys can use, then the race is now on to try to automate as much of this as possible. Now, there's a bunch of commercial products out there. I think Safe Breach, and I know that Grim has Crossbow. There are some commercial tools that do these types of things as well, to do this automated threat emulation, to basically detect an organization's capability of reacting and detecting to attacks. Now, how does this tie into the baselining theme? Well, this ties into the baselining theme because it's not just an issue of identifying how your individual systems are baselined, but it's also incredibly important to identify how those individual systems, when attacked, basically react with the rest of your security products. And that's where a product like Grim's Crossbow, or Caldera, or Meta, or we'll go through a bunch of them. Let's go through Caldera first. So Caldera doesn't have complete coverage of the attack matrix yet from MITRE, but they have a really, really fantastic start. And it's something that is slowly growing and getting more and more verbose as time goes on. So what you do is you have a number of different techniques that you can utilize, and you can apply those techniques on systems where the agent is currently installed. Now, as a heads up, the agent does actually trip out a lot of antivirus engines. So you're either A, going to have to create an exception for it, or B, you're going to have to modify the Python of the agent, use a tool like py2exe, convert it into an executable to bypass the antivirus engines. Unless you're very familiar with actually modifying Python code to bypass AV engines, what I recommend is just whitelist the actual agents themselves. Now, once the agent is installed, it's not the same as having the backdoor installed. It's basically the puppet master now, that we can basically run the different commands and the different techniques in the MITRE attack matrix on the various hosts that we have identified. Also, with the agent, if you want to test the connectivity with the remote agent, you can actually run commands on the remote hosts. Here, you can see that I'm just running vir, whoami, IAP config, and so on. That'll actually execute the command on the remote system. It's a nice utility built into Caldera to verify that you have connectivity to the various agent systems. Instead of the tool simply coming back and saying, yep, it's installed, you can actually interact with the agent and ensure that it's actually installed and working properly. Now, this is where this gets really, really cool. You can go through and create adversaries, and you can add the different techniques that these adversaries will use. So one of the ways that we're planning on using this at Black Hills Information Security is if we have a customer come up to us and they can say, look, we want to be able to detect Lazarus Group. We can say, fantastic, don't hire us. You can use the Caldera tool, and it'll run all the different commands that the Lazarus Group is known for using. So you can simply fire it off on the inside of your organization. So here you can see Lazarus Group. They have copy file, get creds, list files, exfiltrate files, get admin, get computers. These are the commands that will run on the computer systems that have the agents installed. And then you have to actually monitor your IDS systems, your IPS systems, anything that's doing data exfiltration monitoring like data loss prevention, and also your individual SIMs and maybe even your user behavioral analytics modules to see if you can detect this type of activity in your environment. So it allows you to do that type of modeling. All right, so let's back up for a second. I think this is garbage, all right, just to be completely honest with you. The idea of trying to model your offenses on a specific attacker or specific attackers is one of the worst ideas in computer security today. And anybody that says that they do that is actually complete trash. So why would anybody do this then? Well, even though I think technically it doesn't have a lot of value, whenever you're sitting down and you're trying to talk to management and say, these are all of the things that we cannot detect in our organization, that may not have the direct impact of getting management to actually start funding your various security initiatives. If you can tie it back to a threat actor, however, and you can say, these are all the different techniques the Lazarus Group is using, and we can't detect half of them, it almost makes it more visceral. So it becomes more of a political play, I think, in many organizations than it is an actual technical play. Because trying to develop your defenses on a specific attacker is dumb, because then all you have to not be is that attacker. But if you're going to management saying, here is a very real threat actor, these are the vulnerabilities, and these are our blind spots whenever they interact politically, there is still value in doing this. Next, as part of the adversary simulation, we give it a name and we can select the different steps. Now, a while ago, I showed you that nice matrix, and you can select and you can turn on and off different techniques that Caldera will use. So if you only want to check a handful of them, let's say you tried to implement a SIM rule anytime someone tries to mount a share on another workstation, great. You can actually test that one specific component across multiple systems. If you're doing data exfil, you can do raw TCP, HTTP, HTTPS, give it an IP address and a port, and then the systems that you have the agents installed will try to do data exfiltration out of your environment. This is put in place specifically to be able to detect whether or not your DLP or your firewalls that are watching your egress traffic are actually functioning the way that they should. Then you have all the different hosts. They show up on this neat little screen, and they got these cute little circles. And then you go through and set up the full, is the going to drop malware on the system? They call it a RAT, for remote access tool. How is it going to start? Is it going to start with system privileges? Is it going to be an active user? Are we going to execute it from Explorer, and so on? This is important because it's giving you the full path on how these agents are going to trigger and execute the remote access Trojan. That's basically going to then be dropping the malware on the computer systems. Finally, whenever it's done running, it'll give you all the operational details of all the different steps that it ran and whether or not those steps were successful. Now the work begins. If you're doing host baselining, once again, just not baselining the individual systems and services and processes and users, but now we're baselining how that individual host reacts when it's actually under an active attack or post-exploitation activity. So now you can go through and you can say, all right, so the system tried to enumerate all the users in the domain with net user space / domain. Were we able to detect this command executing, either through our SIM or something like a Carbon Black or a Cylance or a CrowdStrike? If you were not able to detect it, you now have a gap in your overall security architecture. We can drop down and say, well, were they able to enumerate administrators? Did we detect that? Time on systems. Were we able to detect them trying to use create services on the Windows computer systems and so on? This is where it's going to be a lot of effort on your team. You're going to take every single one of these attacks. You're going to take the commands that were run, and then you're going to go back and see if you were able to detect these commands running on your environment. If you didn't, you have a little bit of work to do. Either it's going to have some type of tuning on your SIM, or it might actually have to entail a whole new endpoint security product on your computer systems as well. So that is what I have for Caldera. I wanted to show you a couple of other things. So Caldera is very beta at the moment. It is an extremely beta product. There are some scripts that you can do that involve manually running commands. One of them is from Red Canary. And the Red Canary, if I do Red Canary, and the name of it is Atomic Red Team. And this is a collection of scripts spearheaded by Casey Smith, or Sub-T, that you can also use. Instead of trying to use it in an automated tool with a nice front end, you can actually go into each of these different operating systems and you can run the individual commands associated with that technique. Like we got user add, adding a user to a local group, adding a user to domain, doing it in PowerShell as well. And this is really cute because we actually have a Trevor account. And yes, Trevor forever, Trevor forget. So check out the Atomic Red Team from Red Canary because it has a lot of the commands. The other thing that is currently being worked on by Chris Gates is a wonderful little tool called MITRE. Once again, doing a lot of the exact same things that we saw with MITRE's Caldera and also with Red Canary's Atomic Red Team. He is working on his own little tool that does this as well. And it's pretty slick, to be honest with you. It takes these individual YAML rules, and then it can execute the commands associated with those YAML rules. And it gives you a nice little tie back to where the initial technique actually came up. You can create the scenarios. So this is on its way, and this is something that's going to automate the running of a number of different techniques. And it's called MITRE, and it is at github.com. And it's under uber-common/MITRE. The final one I'm really excited about is Unfetter. Now, Unfetter, I'm hearing that this is actually from the NSA and one of the things that they're working on to get out there. This looks to be very full-featured. It's got a very nice front end. How mature it is and how stable it is, I don't know, because I literally found out about it yesterday, but it looks fantastic. It looks like it does the same thing as MITRE, automates the ability to run a lot of the different techniques in that matrix, allows you to select which techniques you're going to use, and then tracking the status of those techniques that were actually employed on the individual computer systems. And the best part about it is free, folks. So please check it out. It's Unfetter, Discover, Unfetter. It's unfetter-discover/unfetter in GitHub. And the other thing that's neat is it's actually using Docker. So with Docker, you can run it on Mac, Windows, and Linux, and it'll actually kick it up and run it on any of those systems. And it gives you a lot of portability for moving Unfetter to a wide variety of different projects and platforms. This will eventually become an entire webcast where I go through and try each one of these, we do the pros and cons and balance them out. But it's cool because now we're starting to see adversarial simulation show up more and more in organizations. Let's take a few minutes to understand why that's key. Up until recently, you had red teams, but up until recently, the vast majority of security teams would buy security products without the ability to adequately test and baseline how those products were working in defending the endpoints. We didn't have the ability to baseline anything. We simply had an endpoint, we ran an endpoint security product on it and hoped it worked. Now, with these tools, what we're seeing is an entire framework where you can baseline how effective or non-effective your individual security products are at detecting these types of attacks and techniques that bad guys use every single day in organizations all over the planet. So with that, I want to hand it back over to the team. And Jason, do you have any questions for us from the team of listeners that are on with us live?
John, the first question is, will there be any slides regarding Caldera for future reference?
Yes, I will actually share those slides with the crew. The slides are very basic. There's not a lot to them. But Jason, just shoot me an email and I'll get the slides to you and we can basically merge them together and get them with Chris's slides.
Sounds great. Thanks, John. This one's kind of a long question, so stay with me. When attempting long-tail statistical analysis using Sysmon for running processes, is it only really helpful to attempt to stack them if you have a specific gold image from which you build all your desktops from? Machines that are built manually and patched to the same version appear to vary significantly in their hashes for the same processes. Any guidance, muchly appreciated. Chris,
do you want to take this one or do you want me to? Is Chris still
Okay,
on?
now that I got myself unmuted, let's see. I'll say maybe both of us should answer because we have different perspectives and kind of the worlds that we commonly live in on a day-to-day basis. And I would look at this as, I think I would compare them as two different sets. Anytime you're comparing systems that were built with the gold image, compare them just to the baseline of the gold image. For the systems that are built manually, I think you're going to have to, essentially build a second baseline to match what that looks like. Just because I know my familiarity with gold images or my experience with them has been, there ends up being just a drastic amount of extra crap that's gotten thrown into it that will throw off. It's not going to be on a freshly installed system that you've taken original media from Microsoft, original media or install media from all the third-party vendors you have involved. So I think there's just too many differences to try and lump them into one group. John?
So, but the whole, and we got to back up and understand what the goal of stacked analysis. If you have a gold image, I agree with Chris completely. It's not always going to be a gold image. Whenever the gold image is installed, it immediately starts to change. So the idea of stacked analysis is, let's just assume that we don't have a gold image. We don't have a master perfect image to do the comparison. So what happens is your entire environment becomes the gold image. You're basically doing stacked analysis on all of your systems. And you're saying, well, on all of my systems, I'm running Microsoft Office. On all of my systems, I'm running Chrome. On all of my systems, I'm running Microsoft Edge. I don't care about those processes. On all of my systems, I have the timekeeping software. Don't care about that. So with the long tail analysis, you're stacking your entire environment together. And then you're watching for those discrepancies at the long tail where there's one of these systems that is not like the other. So here's an analogy. Imagine that you're trying to find a needle in a haystack of needles. There's a number of ways that you could try to find a specific needle in a haystack. And one of the ways that you could do it is you could try sorting all of the straw, all the sticks of straw of all the hay, and you could line them all up by size. And then it becomes much easier because now you're like, well, my needle is this big. I'm not going to look at every single piece of hay in this entire stack of hay. I'm just going to go down specifically to the size that I'm interested in. Now you're looking at a much smaller sample set because you have that sorting and that capability built into it. So remember, the goal of this is to basically use the stacked images of all these different thousands of computer systems to find the onesie twosie discrepancies. When you first start doing this, just so you know, it's going to generate a tremendous amount of work. You're going to be removing a whole bunch of non-standard software. I swear to you, you're going to find things like WebShots and Gator from like a decade ago. But that's okay. That's part of the point. You want to start cleaning those systems up, those discrepancy systems where people are running non-standard software. You want to get that under control. In fact, that should be something that you're doing. That's why we added it into the SANS 20 critical controls anywhere as far as software inventory and audit. I think it's control number 1 or number 2. We put it that way because it's literally that important. So this will assist you with the software inventory, assist you with removing non-standard software, and after you get it cleaned up, it makes it much easier to find the malware specimens as well.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question. I think this is a good one. I think this almost could be a webcast or a blog post on itself. So here we go. We're currently in process of building standard Golden Corp image for Win 10. What's your recommendation for vetting endpoint security posture be for certifying the image for production?
So I'm going to ask them a question. What is are you looking to purchase an endpoint security product, or are you looking to develop the gold baseline image for the operating system? Because those are two different things and the approach would be different. So if they could type in their answer and I can just kind of riff on it. If you're looking at trying to evaluate your endpoint security product, the tools that we talked about at the end of the session today, when we're talking about Red Canary Atomic Red Team, we're talking about MITRE CALDERA, we're talking about Meta, as part of the Uber-common repository at GitHub. These are great utilities that you can run to evaluate your endpoint security product. It should be able to detect these different commands that are running on these computer systems. Second, if you're looking at it for just the baseline and trying to develop a gold image, there's some tools you use. You can use the Center for Internet Security baseline guides. That's fine. And I would recommend doing that. But don't spend too much time on it. The reason why is when we're trying to break into organizations, if you've completely locked it down to like DISA-STIGs, NSA SNAC guides, or the CIS guides, it really doesn't impact the attacks that much for trying to lock down the operating system. It was really important back in 2099, and we still have people talking about it today. But as far as real world attack scenarios, there's really no difference for us breaking into an organization, whether or not they used a secure gold baseline image to develop their operating system. And I know that that runs counter to a lot of wisdom, but we do a lot of assessments. I think we're like 200 now a year, and we have a lot of baseline documentation to back this up. In fact, the first time I got to thinking about this was Black Hat 3 years ago. I was there with Richard Bachlick, and Richard had this awesome class. It was an attack and defend class. And his image that he gave his students of Windows was actually the DISA Gold Disk image that was completely locked down. And he was going through how you could still compromise that image. That really drove that point home for me. And really, if you're going to use an image, great, do so, but don't spend too much time trying to look into it too deeply.
All right. His response was the gold baseline for OS.
Yep, gold baseline. So yeah, don't spend a whole lot of time trying to like get that. Basically, use something like CIS, baseline it. It isn't as important as it was back in 99 and 2000, not nearly.
And that is all the time we have. I'm going to turn it back over to Carol. Thank you both for the webcast today.
All right, well, thank you so much, Chris and John, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.